Hey folks, Steve here with another End of Empire video for you today. We're going to be looking at a couple of smaller scenarios in this video. I may fit more than one into this depending on timing, because we actually have a couple of smaller scenarios before we hit the big show with the American Revolution. So I want to get these out of the way. They'll be pretty quick scenarios, I think. The reason I'm doing this particular one, which happens to be Pontiac's Rebellion, is because we had played through our French and Indian War scenario, and that ended up, I had intended to possibly play the extended scenario and then the extended scenario plus Pontiac's Rebellion as a variant thing, but the war ended ahead of that ultimately, and there wasn't a reason to keep going, and so I'm going to still spin this off. So where this scenario, it uses the French and Indian War campaign counters. So if you have the base game, then you're good to go. But the actual scenario information for this as a distinct scenario comes from Paper Wars '86 from Compass. So if you're curious, you can go check out that issue, and it's got a bunch of good stuff. It has its own game too. I can't remember off the top of my head what game comes in that issue, but there's plenty of good stuff in that issue anyway. Even if you're just you didn't want to just buy it for End of Empire reasons, though I think that's the reason I did way back. Okay, so Pontiac's Rebellion. Let's read the scenario context. We understand what it is we're looking at here, if you're not familiar already. Pontiac's Rebellion was a war that was launched in 1763 by a loose confederation of elements of Native American tribes, primarily from the Great Lakes region, the Illinois country, and Ohio country, who were dissatisfied with British post-war policies in the Great Lakes region after the British victory in the French and Indian War. Warriors from numerous tribes joined the uprising in an effort to drive British soldiers and settlers out of the region. The war is named after the Ottawa leader Pontiac, the most prominent of many native leaders in the conflict. The scenario uses the North map and begins on turn 1, which is spring 1763, and ends after turn 4. So this is only a 4-turn scenario. I'm using this turn track to do 1, 2, 3, 4, just so you guys can see that. And this fortification marker reminds me not to go to turn 5. Use the American Revolution turn track, which is what I'm doing. Use the French and Indian War units. No expansion counters are used. Historical note: Rogers Rangers had been officially disbanded at this time. The unit represents 260 men from the 80th Light Infantry and New York Volunteers under James Dalyell and Robert Rogers, who relieved Detroit in July but were defeated at Bloody Run. Okay, so they're calling that out because Rogers Rangers is a unit in this setup. So this scenario is very small. It is really down to a handful of hexes. And in fact, some of the hexes start with the Native American tribes, I guess, sort of besieging or squatting outside the outposts and having them under threat. So to quickly kind of show what we're talking about, so we have Fort Detroit out here where we have the reduced single step 80th Light Infantry in a fortification, and then we've got 3 Native American tribe units outside of it, the Ottawa, Miami, and Huron. Then we have what was Fort Duquesne, which I'm not sure if they consider this Fort Pitt yet, if Fort Pitt had been built. I unfortunately don't know. I feel like I should know when Fort Pitt was established, but I don't off the top of my head. So we have a reduced regular regiment here, single step in a fortification with 3 units as well. This would be the Mingo, the Delaware, and the Shawano. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that to some degree. And then out here in Hex 2110 are the Seneca and their village. And then we have finally out here in Fort Niagara, we have Roberts Rangers as the scenario noted, and then we do have a regular regiment in the fort. Now, there will be reinforcements on turn 2. They are underneath this red die marked for number 2, so I don't forget. Because they go to a hex that's not, in my opinion, well, sticks out. It's Carlisle, but doesn't stick out well for me, so I'm trying to remember for that. We end up getting several things. We get a regular step, another regular step. We get this 1st Pennsylvania enlistment unit, and we get this 2-step unit here. What's important about this stack is that this bottom unit and the Pennsylvania enlistment are the only units in the stack with ambush defense factors. So, the stack is going to have to go. We're going to be really careful with where these guys move, because if these top 2 units try to move by themselves, they're just going to get killed in the wilderness. Because every enemy unit against the British in this scenario are the native units. Okay, so are there any withdrawals? No. Victory conditions are that the British player wins of all 3 fort hexes, so here, here, and here, are free of Indians after turn 4. The Indians win if they have at least 1 unit outside the fort in at least 2 of these hexes. So right now they have units outside of 2 hexes, so the British need to change that. Or else, if 1 fort is invested, the game is a draw. So right now, the Native Americans are in a victory condition. If the British can remove 1, then it's a draw. If all 3 have native units on there, then they'll win as well. Whatever. So, it's relatively easy to adjudicate. The British want to clear these Indians from, harassing and raiding the forts. And there are some special rules here that are important. All Indian units are always considered to succeed in initiative rolls on turns 1 through 3. So for the first 3 turns, all of the units can activate. So no of this rolling and hoping for a 2. With the default leader, they always activate on the first 3 turns. The 4th turn, they're going to have trouble. A British force containing the... I'm going to not be able to relate that to you very easily because I have trouble reading that. But this is the 60th Regiment of the 1st Royal something. I would have to go look it up in the book. I'm sorry. But this particular unit, which is Colonel Bouquet's expedition, I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that correctly, is always considered to succeed on initiative rolls on turns 2 to 3. So when he enters, this unit at least will always, or British force containing this unit, so it could be this whole reinforcement stack, which probably would be, I think, will always activate on turns 2 to 3, so for the first 2 turns. So it's really going to be, okay, well, how do you want to handle this, right? What do you do to play through this scenario? This is a very quick scenario too, right, guys? Like, I feel like I'm not even going to... How am I going to do this with you? I think, because I think this is a short scenario, and this video won't be terribly long, I think I'm just going to, now that I've given the intro, and maybe I'll spend another minute talking about how I think this is going to play out, I'll just go play the 4 turns, and we'll show the aftermath, and then we'll segue into another small scenario for this video before the American Revolution. I think that's probably the easiest, best way to handle this, because this is a very small scenario. Thankfully, because there are more units on the board, and a lot of these units are going to have automatic initiative, at the very least, the scenario feels like it's going to be at least a little bit better than, say, the Chickasaw Wars, where there wasn't as much going on. Here, I think there's a little bit more. That if you were comparing this to the Chickasaw War scenario, like, and you want natives versus Europeans in a very wilderness-based context, like, I feel like this is This is probably a little more interactive and a little more interesting than Chickasaw War. So if you wanted to compare the two scenarios, I'm going to bet that this is more interactive, more interesting than Chickasaw Wars by the time I'm done with it. Though I don't think this is, this might not be a highlight scenario either. We'll see. So how do we think this is going to go? Well, I think the guys out here, it definitely makes sense to try to hold, right? We need to at least leave somebody there. If they try to come out of the fort, they have one ambush defense factor, and these guys, I don't know. Maybe these guys don't move. These guys, I could see a case being where maybe we move him out and just try to play field defense or something. And then the other thing is like, okay, does this guy hang back and wait for Robert Rogers to move? So let's say Robert Rogers starts heading up to relieve Fort Detroit, and these guys all of a sudden do that. And I think that's probably something that's going to happen. These guys don't have any ambush factors, so they're definitely going to want to sit in the fort, and it's going to go like that, I'm sure. Almost assuredly going to go like that, I think. I think what the British would want to do is like come up here, try to disperse these guys, free up that, then start to snake down Lake Erie, pick some path back down, try to relieve this stack, and then, or come back down here and relieve Fort Niagara, one of the two. And then what we have is the reinforcements try to relieve Fort Pitt or Fort Duquesne, whichever one is still in existence in that hex as of this year, in 1763. Now I got to look it up because it's going to bother me if I don't look it up. I need to know which fort it is right now. Probably not Fort Pitt. I don't think maybe they did build it. All right. Anyway, guys, distraction. I think that's going to make the most sense. We send Robert Rogers out, clear, comes back, assuming this guy sits on top of Fort Niagara. This stack focuses on relieving Fort Pitt, and that's the British, I think, method of victory. And then for the natives, I can't think of much more to do other than maybe to remove one unit from each fort hex and sit somewhere inconvenient, like here, so that when Robert Rogers comes in, they intercept and they ambush or something. I feel like something like that is probably the best option for them to, there's not much that they can do, but you'd certainly want to do something there to keep them from getting to the forts. So that's sort of the active defense I think the natives could try to do is just try to get one unit out there, because what could happen is you could have these guys sally forth from the fort, and if these guys fail to ambush properly, they could get wiped out in linear combat, and that's it's possible, even if it's unlikely, it is possible. So the native player can't just remove every unit; they have to keep some in the hex and maybe send one out further to intercept any British coming to relieve. And I think that's the little puzzle here, and it's just going to come down to maybe some of the ambush die rolls that are going to decide this. So let me run through that, and we'll come back. We'll show the aftermath and talk about how the scenario went. Okay, guys, here we go. Here we are at the end of the scenario, and it's a draw. Felt a little deterministic. I felt like there was only so many options that could occur here, and I'm not surprised by the results. So let's quickly recount what happened. Robert Rogers went up Lake Erie using the lake hex side is operating as if it were a river, and moved up to here. Natives, you moved one unit out to try to disrupt him. Robert Rogers defeated that unit, and then eventually came up here. And what happened was that the natives successfully ambushed Robert Rogers and eliminated him. But then they also dispersed because they were all involved in one combat. And what I guess I should have done, and I didn't, and maybe it would have meant they wouldn't have successfully ambushed Robert Rogers. So, like, just one of these weird decisions. Like, I should have maybe reacted one unit out here, or like up here, fought. Maybe they would have ambushed and defeated Robert Rogers, and then the remaining native unit that didn't disperse after combat, after doing a step loss, walks back, and then they've got it covered. It just didn't work out that way. The unit that started here, the Seneca, did come over to Fort Niagara, and then the stack that came in on turn two, um, the natives did move a unit down here to kind of play the field a little bit. So the expedition used this river line to get up to here. The native tribe moved over to here. They had a little fight. The failure to ambush on the native part dispersed that unit, and then the stack continued onward to Fort Duquesne, Fort Pitt, whatever, and managed to get through that ambush, a failed ambush, and clear the hex. So functionally, what we're seeing is Fort Detroit is relieved, Fort Duquesne Pitt is relieved, but now Fort Niagara has a tribe harassing its supply lines and whatnot in the hex, or however you want to look at that. And so the game is a draw. Now I could see it being we could probably. What's interesting, like each of these units automatically has initiative, right? To succeed on initiative rolls is how to look at that. So what this means is, like, assuming they have enough movement points, they're not going to stop because of combat, right? That's sort of one thing that can happen. Like, you fight, there's a chance you can't activate again after a fight, and so you get slowed down. In this case, because all except for turn 4, many units can just automatically activate, they can keep going even after a combat. So there's this very, like, where do you want the combats to be? You can't send the native units out to these hexes and just, like, slow them down via too many combats, because they can just keep going after each combat. Like, Robert Rogers is an automatic move unit, right? So he can activate pretty much all the time. And by special rule, a lot of these other units are going to activate all the time. So you can't flood the zone and be too effective, right? That's not enough, because the units are going to plow through your flooded hexes of units, and when they reach the fort, whatever's left, whatever native units are left, one's not going to be enough probably to stop the force that's coming into the hex now. But then there's just this, unless you were to send Robert Rogers down here to clear out the Seneca, which I just didn't seem to have the ability to do much with that. You're almost guaranteed to have the Seneca sitting on here, as soon as you leave. I could maybe see where you send Robert Rogers down here first, and then maybe he works his way up, and maybe that's what I should have done, but it's like you only have so many turns to operate with. So, ultimately, I could see the scenario probably coming to a draw a lot of the time if you were to play it. There's not that many decisions to make, though. I could definitely have tried to play the scenario a little bit differently in terms of where I place the Native American units, like where I moved them to try to slow down the British. But so I think my assessment after the scenario is very much like I had going in, which is that it's certainly more interactive, or feels a little more engaging than Chickasaw Wars. It's still a pretty basic scenario. There's not a whole lot to chew on here. But if you want a little bit of a mini exercise of moving units around and kind of very puzzle like, it's an okay scenario, I guess, right? Not much to it. Not much to it. Okay, guys. Well, that is it for that. Let's move on to the next scenario with maybe a brief intermission. Okay, and just the brief intermission is regarding this whole Fort Duquesne, Fort Pitt thing that I'm spun up on. So it's something I should know. I should just know this, because I'm from roughly this part of the country originally. So it's important to know that, like, Fort Duquesne was taken and brought low during the War of the French and Indian War, and then replaced with Fort Pitt. I could tell you, without looking it up, that Fort Pitt is not on the exact same site as Fort Duquesne. It's not like they changed the banner. Like it was a totally different site technically that was nearby, but was established as Fort Pitt. But it's all like near enough that it's in one hex in this game, right? I had forgotten that Fort Pitt was constructed during the French and Indian War itself. In I guess it must have been 58 is what I'm reading. Um, oh, 59. I apologize. I've got. I am sorry, guys. Yeah, in 59. So after the British had kind of taken and destroyed Fort Duquesne, they did put the fort into effect, and it was in starting in 1759. I think they had it constructed by then. So that was sort of the thing. So every time I referred to here, it was Fort Pitt itself that had been built and constructed during the course of the French and Indian War. In this scenario, had been established for a couple years at this point. So okay, that's the end of the Pontiac's rebellion scenario. We'll shift gears to another scenario for this video. Okay, so now we are going to look at one last scenario before we start the American Revolution playthrough series within this larger series on the End of Empire game. So we're going to be looking at Lord Dunmore's War, 1774. So just a year before the American Revolution really breaks out. This is another wilderness-based scenario. Now, this scenario, I can't speak for everyone. I'm just going to be careful how I say it. This came in my game box when I purchased the game, if I remember correctly anyway. And is this like bonus sheet. So if you own the game, check for this. If you don't have it, you may want to reach out to Compass to see, like if you bought the game secondhand or something, like this bonus scenario may not have been included originally. I really don't know, but you should be able to look for this. It's just a page long. There's not much to it, so I don't think it would be hard to replicate somehow if you couldn't get your hands on the material itself. This one has a lot of historical context with it too, so I'm going to read it out loud, just kind of add some fun. Lord Dunmore's War, or Dunmore's War, was a 1774 conflict between the colony of Virginia and the Shawnee and Mingo American Indian nations. The governor of Virginia during the conflict was John Murray, 4th Earl of Dunmore, Lord Dunmore. He asked the Virginia House of Burgesses to declare a state of war with the hostile Indian nations and order up an elite volunteer militia force for the campaign. The conflict resulted from escalating violence between British colonists who, in accordance with previous treaties, were exploring and moving into land south of the Ohio River, modern West Virginia and Kentucky, and American Indians who held treaty rights to hunt there. As a result of successive attacks by Indian hunting and war bans upon the settlers, war was declared, quote, to pacify the hostile Indian war bands, end quote. The war ended soon after Virginia's victory in the Battle of Point Pleasant on October 10th, 1774. As a result of this victory, the Indians lost the right to hunt in the area and agreed to recognize the Ohio River as the boundary between Indian lands and the British colonies. Although the Indian national chieftains signed the treaty, conflict within the Indian nation soon broke out. Some tribesmen felt the treaty sold out their claims and opposed it, and others believed that another war would mean only further losses of territory to the more powerful British colonists. When war broke out between the colonials and the British government in 1776, the war parties of the Indian nations quickly gained power. They mobilized the various Indian nations to attack the colonists during the Revolutionary War. And they also include a link to the Wikipedia article for this conflict, so you can read a little more about it if you wish to do so. The scenario is played using both maps, although only the junctional area is used, which is true. It's very interesting. We like right here is the map crossover. You can kind of see. I lined it up pretty darn good, but there's a little bit of shift you can see. So it's like we're playing right on the border between the two maps. The scenario begins on turn 1, June 1744, and concludes after turn 3. So we're going to use the American Revolution War turn track, and it's just going to be 3 turns. So this, again, hyper small scenario. The British setup have Lord Dunmore himself at Fort Pitt, along with the 2nd Virginia Regiment, and Crawford, who happens to be one of those guys who activates all the time. But interestingly, he's got a circled combat factor, which means he can't attack. So I don't know what to do with him. That's kind of interesting. Yeah, weird. And then we also have the 1st Virginia Regiment out here in the middle of nowhere. And I'm kind of like, 5214, like that's the right hex. They are in the middle of nowhere. Might have been a settlement there or something, but at least on the map, there's nothing there. But Point Pleasant is currently occupied by the Shawnee Indians here at the connection confluence of a couple of rivers, and is considered an outpost if we can get somebody in there. So they're sitting right on top. We need to get that. And then we also have the Mingo that are just north of Fort Pitt. As best as I can tell, are opposed to the British in this situation. So the victory conditions. British player wins if he occupies Point Pleasant, right here, at the end of the game, and has entered both Indian village hexes. Otherwise, the Indian player wins. So the Mingo village is right here, so it's going to be as simple as these guys maneuvering into Mingo, maybe clearing that unit, and then they're going to kind of be forced to come down the river, disperse this guy, and come into the hex. Nothing too crazy. This is going to be another one of these small deterministic scenarios where it's really going to be like, hey, did the ambush succeed or not? That's really what, your choices are going to be really straightforward, it feels like. And that's it. That's the scenario. Not much, guys. There's not much here. The calm before the storm of the American Revolution, I guess, in comparison, in terms of the number of units involved. So, what do we have to really look at here? Well, before I go play it, because again, this is 3 turns. I think what I'll do is I'll play it off camera. We'll come back. We'll show the aftermath. I'll kind of talk a little bit more about it. Here's the thing. This guy's got the default leader, which means I don't expect him to activate on his own. Dunmore can activate, and he can bring with him this militia, and then this guy can activate all the time. Now, he can do an ambush, but his linear combat is crap, I guess. So I'm not even sure how to use him. I suppose if he has a plus ambush factor, he must be able to ambush. He must be able to ambush, and then what? Nothing else? I don't know how that works. This is the first time I've seen a unit with a circled combat factor, but an offensive ambush factor like that. That's weird, and I'm not sure how to look at that. But assuming I say, okay, well, we will have him, like, he could move into this hex, probably disperse the native tribe, and then we hopefully activate Lord Dunmore, and he starts heading down the river, and maybe we try to activate these guys and head up the river. That's maybe what we need to do. I'm a little concerned that I could play this wrong, because I just don't understand how the Crawford unit should work, but I'm not given any more hints as to how he probably ought to work. So let me go play this, just 3 turns, and we'll come back. Okay, guys, here we are at the end of turn 2, and the scenario's over. There's not much to say. It basically came down to the native units failed to execute successful ambushes, and basically were just defeated in linear combat, and then the British using the river lines to get to the villages. Now, the one thing would be, after the units were defeated, it's like, do you interpret the Indian withdrawal to mean they can't come back till the next spring turn? If so, then the British could just walk into here. If you say that they are dispersed, but then if there's one intervening turn, maybe they can come in and defend their own village, if you walk into it. But I said, okay, well, let's say even if they did do that and they failed another ambush die roll and were defeated again. So I sort of had, like, a bifurcated situation. Say, well, they win if you don't let them come back in the village after being defeated on a different turn, right? So we had walked into the Mingo village and dispersed them, and it was like, okay, well, they were defeated that turn, and we entered the village on that turn. Dunmore ended up not activating after that, but we did get, I kid you not, 2 default later activations on this unit for some reason. Um, so they would have won that way. But if you said, well, okay, on a different turn, if you're not in their village, they could maybe come back, because they, just let's just assume they're allowed to do that to save their village. Well, they still failed to ambush the British, and the British managed to win. Um, so I don't know. I feel like this is one of those like interesting little historical things to look at. Again, I feel like some of these scenarios, particularly these smaller ones, they are much like some scenarios from a game called Imperium Romanum, which covers ancient Rome. That some scenarios are just kind of there for you to play out the history, and are maybe not, they're not competitive scenarios. They are historical playthings. I don't know a better way to say it. You're there to fiddle with the history and kind of see how it plays out. Not saying that this is a competitive game scenario. This is a historical scenario that you can kind of see how things played out, or how they maybe could have played out slightly differently. It's not like there's a competitive game here. So an interesting exercise in terms of understanding the history and what was going on at the time, and you can learn a lot along the way. But I would put this scenario along with Chickasaw Wars as one that I don't know, if you're interested in kind of playing around with this scenario, you're doing some reading on Lord Dunmore's War, and you want something a little tangible to go with that, I think this works. I think if you're looking for like, hey, I really want to play a war game, you probably don't want to play this scenario. You're probably going to be looking at the French and Indian War scenario, King George's War, or the American Revolution scenario, which is coming next. And again, the dramatic difference between a scenario like this, where there's very few leaders, there are very few die rolls, period, means that the luck can go wildly. Like if we had successfully um, rolled to ambush, the British might not have enough units on the board to win at all, right? It's certainly possible for that to be the case. It's just there's so few die rolls that are going to determine the fate of the scenario here, where the biggest scenario like American Revolution, which we'll do next, is going to have just a lot of die rolls, and we should see the luck have less of an impact because there are so many more die rolls. That luck will average out a little bit, and it'll be more focused on the decisions we made along the way than just what the dice happen to give us. We're here. I mean, it's like 3 die rolls really mattered, and if those 3 die rolls go a certain way, that's kind of the whole scenario in a nutshell. But again, interesting to kind of see what the situation was. This playthrough series for End of Empire for me is a fun little exercise of playing through the history of what was going on in North America at the time, the struggles of the Native American tribes to, one, exist and to deal with the incoming pressure from European peoples and the settlements and the colonists and everything happening there, and the conflicts between the colonists, the different European powers, this tapestry of history. And of course, of course, I'm biased. I'm American, so I live in the United States, born and raised, and so for me, this is like, oh, it's the history, it's stuff I already know about, but it's fun to engage with it. So at least from that perspective, I think this game has a ton of value just for that reason alone. It's just being a nice system to play around with, and to kind of go through the history of this part of the world for a certain period of time. So anyway, guys, that is your 2-for-1 video. 2 small scenarios between the French and Indian War and the American Revolutionary War, War of American Revolution, however you want to refer to it. That is next. That's the big show. We're headed right to it, guys. So I hope you enjoyed this one. This is a small little appetizer. We've already had like a 7-course meal, or however many scenarios I've done, and we still have the main course. The main course is still to come, guys. The whole game, the whole big reason the game exists, we have not even touched upon yet, and all this stuff that we've covered so far. And for those of you who've been watching and watching every episode of this series and have been engaged, thank you for watching. I do appreciate when folks are bringing up the rules things. I do think over the course of all the playing, I probably have made some rules mistakes or have forgotten a roll, a leader loss roll when I should have, and all that kind of thing. I'm sure it's happened. I like to think I've been pretty good about it. And in fact, somebody had pointed out, maybe on one turn I forgot to double the movement cost on the north map during winter, and I'm pretty sure I must have because there's no other way for me to have done what I did. Did that change the whole scope of the game? Yeah, maybe, but due to the combat that mattered, it's entirely possible. But sometimes you just gotta, I don't know, you gotta roll with it. And I'm gonna do, because the American Revolution is the bigger deal, I'm gonna try really hard, be very meticulous about making sure I'm playing the rules correctly for that scenario, because it will be long. There'll be a lot of units moving around, a lot of stuff will be important, and it'll be really important that I'm on my game for all important rules like the leader losses, like the winter movement and supply tracing and all of that. And I think I've done pretty good. Maybe I made a few mistakes. I'm going to try my very level best to minimize any potential mistakes for this next set of videos. And it's going to be for sure more than one. I don't think I can do the whole American Revolution in one video. The French and Indian War took 2. I could see the American Revolution taking 3 or 4, depending on how much there is to talk about. And I'm sure there will be a lot, plenty to talk about over the course of that scenario. In fact, we might even just have an intro video that is just an intro video because of how much stuff we're going to need to talk about. So we'll see you in that one, guys. Sorry for the ramble. I hope you enjoyed this video. Hit like, do the whole thing as you do. Until the next one, take care. Keep on game.